The winter light over Southern California in the last months of 1939 had a peculiar clarity to it, the kind that made every ridge sharp and every metal surface glow. At March Field near Riverside, the Army Air Corps flight line stretched out in neat rows observation planes, antiquated biplanes nearing retirement, a handful of new monoplanes that represented the future. Pilots joked that the airfield looked like a museum pretending to be modern, but it was not the aircraft that drew the most confusion from the men who trained there. It was a building. To the west of the runway stood a newly erected structure, rectangular, featureless, steel-framed, and completely indifferent to aerodynamics. "Looks like a farm shed someone hammered together after church," Lieutenant Robert Ellison muttered as he walked past it in his flight jacket, breath showing in short puffs. Others called it the box, for lack of anything more dignified. No curves, no graceful arch, no sweeping trusses, just flat panels, bolted steel ribs, and a roofline so simple that a child could sketch it. Nobody on that field, not Ellison, not his commanding officers, not the civilian contractors who had erected the thing in less than a week, understood that this awkward, barn-like hangar would help the United States build 300,000 aircraft before the war was over. At that moment, it was only a structure, practical, cheap, and ugly. Across the continent, the same winter sun slanted across Langley Field in Virginia, where the tidal marshes met the rigid geometry of one of America's oldest air bases. Here, too, a box-shaped hangar stood incongruously beside older, ornate brick buildings built in the 19-teens. The old structures had character-arched windows, decorative brickwork, sweeping beams of varnished wood. They belonged to a time when airfields were experiments, not engines of war. The new hangar was the opposite of beauty. A rectangle of steel and corrugated sheeting painted a plain government grey. Yet inside, mechanics had room to work on 3 pursuit planes at once, and the rectangular floor meant tool benches, parts racks, and fuel drums could be arranged with mathematical efficiency. It was mundane. It was functional. And it was the future. The idea behind the box-shaped hangar did not begin with the Army Air Corps. Its lineage ran through Detroit, through the office of industrial architect Albert Kahn, the man who had redesigned American manufacturing by stripping buildings down to their functional essence. Kahn rejected ornament, curvature, and architectural vanity. He designed factories as machines rectilinear, modular, scalable, spaces where production could flow like water. By 1939, Kahn's principles dominated American industry, and procurement officers in the Army Air Corps were paying close attention. They faced a crisis that few civilians understood. Airpower required space, not just the runways and taxiways seen in newsreels, but sheltered places to repair engines, install radios, teach young men how to maintain the increasingly complex systems inside modern aircraft. America had pilots. America had engineers. What it lacked was room. Germany did not have this problem. The Luftwaffe had been preparing for war since the early 1930s, building permanent air bases with concrete hangars, heavy steel doors, reinforced floors, and hardened facilities. They were few, but they were formidable fixed fortresses of aviation. America, by contrast, had more land than it knew what to do with, but too few structures, and every traditional hangar required months of labor, trained construction crews, and materials that the Army knew would soon be needed elsewhere. The procurement officers studying Kahn's factory templates saw the answer in a single sketch: a rectangle, a box, something that could be stamped out like parts on an assembly line. The design specifications were written with wartime urgency. The hangar had to be modular, so it could be expanded bay by bay. It had to be lightweight enough to be shipped by rail anywhere in the country. It had to be erected by unskilled crews, farmhands, mechanics, volunteers, anyone with a wrench. It had to withstand desert heat, coastal storms, prairie winds, and tropical humidity. And most of all, it had to be built fast. The result resembled nothing in the architectural textbooks of the era. It was blunt, square, and homely. But it could be transported flat, like furniture in a crate, and bolted together in as little as 72 hours. No cranes were required, no concrete arches, no specialized steelworkers. Just a grid, a skin of corrugated metal, and doors tall enough for any fighter the Air Corps was flying in 1940. Pilots at first mocked it because the thing looked flimsy, but engineers loved it because it worked. The hangar's interior volume, plain as it was, held astonishing potential. A rectangular workspace allowed standardized tool storage, uniform lighting, optimized airflow for engine testing, and the ability to service multiple aircraft at once. In a traditional arched hangar, space was lost to curvature. In a rectangular one, every inch counted. What looked crude was actually efficient. Still, no one in 1939 imagined what would come next. Europe was already at war, but the United States still stood in uneasy neutrality, watching Poland burn, then Denmark, then Norway, then France. The Army Air Corps scrambled to expand pilot training, but training meant airfields, and airfields meant hangars. The procurement numbers tell the story that the pilots at Riverside and Langley could not yet see. By the end of 1940, the Army had ordered thousands of these rectangular steel hangars from manufacturers like Butler Manufacturing and Strand Steel. By the spring of 1941, they were being erected across the Great Plains, the Pacific Coast, the Deep South, and the Rocky Mountain states. America had quietly begun constructing an aviation empire. The contrast with Germany was becoming stark. The Luftwaffe's pre-war infrastructure was strong but fixed, built for a short war expected to end in swift victory. America was building for something else. Scale. This was the central idea that would define the coming conflict. In industrial warfare, the mundane outruns the magnificent. Pretty infrastructure collapses under the weight of logistics. Plain infrastructure thrives under it. The pilots at March Field walked past their ugly hangar without realizing it represented a shift greater than any single aircraft design. A nation that could build airfields faster than others could bomb them held an advantage no ace pilot could overcome. A nation that could repair aircraft faster than enemies could shoot them down would control the war's tempo. And a nation that could service, shelter, and maintain the output of its factories could build 300,000 planes and still ask for more. The box-shaped hangar did not look like history. It looked like storage. But history is often built in rectangles, places where men work, where machines wait, where the quiet business of preparation multiplies into power. And in the closing months of 1939, on two opposite coasts, American airmen stood beside a building that they did not yet understand. They would. The world would, and the war would be shaped by it. By early 1941, the box-shaped hangar was no longer a curiosity, it was a template. At Wright Field in Ohio, procurement officers spread blueprints across long drafting tables, measuring not beauty but speed. How fast could a building go from blueprint to bolts? How many identical structures could be stamped out before the year was over? How many airfields could be multiplied before war arrived? The answer, they realized, lay not in architecture but in repetition. The hangar existed in only one shape, but in dozens of sizes. A small variant could shelter a single pursuit aircraft. A medium version could house a flight of trainers. The largest could swallow bombers whole. Yet the differences were superficial. Every size used the same ribs, the same joints, the same roof panels, the same prefabricated doors. A hangar in Kansas was identical to one in Georgia or Oregon. Toolkits matched, spare parts matched. Assembly instructions could be memorized in a morning. This was architectural standardization on a wartime scale. The War Department created what it called the Rapid Field Package, a rail car's worth of components that could convert any flat patch of earth into a functioning air station. One shipment included runway matting, fuel bladders, generator sheds, barracks, and at the center of it all, the box-shaped hangar. Engineers joked that the hangar was the keystone of the kit, because without it, nothing else mattered. Aircraft could not be maintained outdoors through winter storms or tropical downpours. Radios corroded, engines overheated, armor rusted, precision instruments warped. To fly every day, aircraft needed shelter, not elegant shelter, just reliable shelter. Germany had elegant shelter, but Germany could not multiply it. In pre-war, Luftwaffe planning documents captured after the war and later studied by Allied analysts, hangars were fixed installations, each requiring concrete foundations, heavy trusses, skilled masons, and months of construction. They were formidable but slow. Each one represented a commitment. This base would last. This base would hold. This base was worth the resources poured into it. American planners operated under a different philosophy. Bases were disposable. Hangars were replaceable. The square hangar could be built, abandoned, relocated, or expanded without ceremony. One officer at Wright Field summarized the difference in a line that would appear in post-war reports. They built monuments, we built machines. The first test of the hangar's speed came in the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941. Thousands of soldiers, airmen, and engineers flooded into the humid countryside to test whether America could sustain large-scale combined arms operations. The Army Air Corps had to establish new forward fields almost overnight. The rectangular hangars arrived by train, unloaded by hand, and rose from the ground in 3 days. The airfields Barksdale, Esler, Alexandria proved the concept. The United States could build faster than its enemies could react. When Congress passed the massive expansion programs of 1940, 1941, and the spring of 1942, the hangar became an industrial product. Butler, Strandsteel, Globe Metal, and half a dozen smaller firms worked under War Department contracts to churn out the pieces, steel ribs punched to identical tolerances, corrugated sheets stamped by the thousands, prefabricated doors with hinges strong enough to survive prairie winds. By the time of Pearl Harbor, hangars were flowing from factories like automobile parts. The irony was that unskilled workers, farm boys, lumber clerks, welders who had never seen an aircraft assembled them. Engineering units at airfields were overwhelmed. The solution was to train civilians. A sergeant at Moffett Field wrote that he worked 1 week with a group of mechanics from Oakland, then the next with migrant farmhands from Bakersfield. If a man can hold a wrench, he can build a hangar, he wrote. And it was true. The modular design made expertise unnecessary. Once America entered the war, the hangars spread with astonishing speed. At Langley Field in Florida, 10 were erected in a single week. At Great Falls Army Air Base in Montana, 17 rose in less than a month to support the Lend-Lease ferry route to Siberia. In Alaska, Seabees bolted together steel ribs while snow drifted around their boots. In the Caribbean, the same structures stood under blazing sun. At Hickam Field, still scarred by fire and bomb craters, replacement hangars went up even as the wreckage of December 7th was being cleared. Everywhere, the boxes multiplied. What made these plain structures revolutionary was not their appearance but what they enabled. They gave the Army Air Forces capacity. The ability to train mechanics in climate-controlled bays. The ability to shelter aircraft that were becoming more complex every month, radar sets, superchargers, turbochargers, pressurized cabins, advanced radios. These systems could not be maintained in open air. Without hangars, the P-38 Lightning, the B-25 Mitchell, the B-29 Superfortress would have been maintenance nightmares. With them, the United States could sustain a tempo of operations that no other nation could match. Behind every pilot who took off from a dusty Nevada field or a frozen Minnesota runway stood a line of mechanics. And behind the mechanics stood the rectangular walls of a hangar that kept their tools dry and their engines warm. Behind every aircraft rolling off the assembly lines at Curtiss, Douglas, Lockheed, North American, and Boeing stood hundreds of identical hangars, training thousands of identical crews. A steel rectangle had become a multiplier. Its strength was not in its walls, but in its reproducibility. That was the secret that America understood, often unconsciously, almost accidentally, that Germany never mastered. War in the 20th century was not won by the extraordinary. It was won by the repeatable, and nothing repeated like the box-shaped hangar. The spring of 1942 brought a crisis disguised as success. America was finally producing aircraft at a pace unmatched in its history, trainers rolling from Vultee's lines in Nashville, pursuit planes leaving North American's plant in Inglewood, Douglas assembly halls humming from Santa Monica to Tulsa. The problem was not making airplanes, it was housing them. At bases from California to Connecticut, new aircraft sat in neat rows under open sky, unprotected from windstorms, hail, sand, and the endless cycles of sun and night cold that aged aluminum faster than combat. Squadron commanders filed increasingly desperate reports to the War Department. "We can train pilots but not maintain aircraft," wrote one officer at Langley Field. 1,000 planes arrive. We have roofs for perhaps 200. The sentiment echoed across the nation like a warning drumbeat. It was the moment the box-shaped hangar stopped being convenient and became indispensable. In Washington, the newly created Army Air Forces Directorate of Installations convened an emergency session in April 1942. Representatives from the Quartermaster Corps, the Corps of Engineers, and the Office of Production Management gathered in a plain room inside the munitions building. The agenda was blunt. If aircraft production was to be doubled, and General Arnold intended to do exactly that, America would need 1,000 new hangars in months, not years. The engineers laid out their pessimistic timelines for conventional construction. 80 days minimum for a wood truss hangar, 120 days for a steel arch structure, longer if foundations required reinforcement. Then a young procurement captain from the installations division slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, rows of simple, rectangular hangars standing at Randolph Field and Maxwell Field, erected in astonishingly short periods. "These went up in days," he said. "Not months, days." The room changed. The officials leaned forward. Work began that afternoon. The Air Forces issued a directive. All new facilities would use the standardized, modular, steel-framed hangar unless mission requirements demanded otherwise. Butler Manufacturing, Strand Steel, and the other producers received telegrams authorizing immediate expansion of facilities, guaranteed contracts, and priority access to steel shipments. The government effectively placed them on wartime footing overnight. What followed was one of the least celebrated but most consequential mobilizations of the war. Across the industrial Midwest, small towns saw their skylines transform. In Kansas City, factory floors glowed under arc lamps as workers stamped corrugated sheets through the night. In Pittsburgh, steel workers rolled the thin-gauge beams that would become the hangar's ribs. In Des Moines, women in denim overalls and stained gloves packed hardware kits, bolts, washers, turnbuckles, into crates destined for air bases hundreds of miles away. The transformation was not contained to factories. At Great Falls, Montana, trains carrying hangar kits rolled in daily, their flat cars stacked high with steel panels. Civilian volunteers, students from the local college, truck drivers, and even ranch hands reported to the base to help. An airman wrote home that he'd never seen anything like it. "A barn raising for airplanes," he joked. "Only instead of a preacher and pie, we've got officers shouting and steel that burns your hands in the sun." The hangars grew with astonishing speed. By June, the fledgling pilots flying AT-6 Texan trainers at the new bases in Texas found themselves sheltered inside rows of identical metal buildings. In Nebraska, the airfields preparing B-29 crews for the Pacific War rose from prairie grass in weeks. At Alamogordo and Roswell, where dust storms once halted training, the new steel shelters kept men and machines working regardless of weather. This was the first visible proof that the hangar's true power was not in its steel, but in its scalability. One base commander wrote, almost incredulous, "I submitted a request for 5 hangars. 10 arrived. I asked no questions." Another reported that the hangars were as good as tents for building, meaning fast, but as strong as barns for keeping airplanes alive. The hangar's modularity also produced unexpected advantages. At Tyndall Field in Florida, storms routinely tore apart wooden structures. The metal hangars, by contrast, swayed and groaned but held firm. At Chanute Field in Illinois, the rectangular interiors allowed training wings to set up, duplicate workshops, engine bays, electrical benches, propeller repair stations, so that mechanics learned their trades in facilities identical to those they would use overseas. Standardization was training in disguise. Then came the summer heat of 1942. Aircraft that had once baked on open ramps, canopies warping, radios overheating, were now pulled into the cool shade of steel shelters. Mechanics worked at night under electric lights bolted to the hangar's rafters, repairing trainers and fighters without the glare of the sun. Pilots slept, knowing their machines would be ready by dawn. Only later did the Air Forces grasp the statistical miracle that had taken place. In 6 months, the Rapid Hangar program had cut weather-related aircraft damage by more than half. Training delays dropped. Aircraft readiness soared. What looked like boxes had become the backbone of wartime aviation. Germany noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports recovered after the war contained a curious observation. American airfields were multiplying so quickly that the German analysts could not map them fast enough. One officer wrote that the Americans seemed capable of creating an airfield where yesterday there was only terrain. Another added, they shelter aircraft as if they grow buildings from the ground. They were not wrong. America was growing hangars like crops, and the need for roofs was only beginning. The war had not yet reached its peak, but the sky was already demanding more. By early 1943, the rectangular steel hangar was no longer simply a structure found on air bases. It had become a cornerstone of an entirely new military ecosystem. America was transforming itself into something no nation had ever attempted. A continental network of factory airfields, each one capable of receiving aircraft fresh from assembly lines, testing them, modifying them, and forwarding them to training units or combat depots with breathtaking speed. The concept emerged almost organically. When the War Department realized that aircraft production would soon reach levels unimaginable only 2 years earlier, they understood that factories alone could not carry the burden. A B-24 Liberator could roll off the line in San Diego or Fort Worth, but it still needed to be flown, serviced, tested, repaired, calibrated, and sometimes rebuilt. The throughput would crush traditional air stations. The answer again came from the uninspired, utterly ordinary rectangle. At Willow Run in Michigan, where Ford Motor Company constructed the largest bomber plant on Earth, production managers worked hand in hand with Air Forces engineers to create a seamless pipeline. The enormous B-24 assembly hall fed into a flight line that was flanked, almost absurdly, by 20 identical box-shaped hangars. These were not built for beauty, they were built for volume. Aircraft emerged from the factory like automobiles on a highway, taxiing straight into their steel shelters, where teams of mechanics, Ford auto workers retrained in aircraft systems, prepared each bomber for its first flight. A foreman described the process with industrial pride. The hangars are stations. We move the plane, not the tools. It was a philosophy lifted directly from Detroit's assembly lines and applied to aviation with military urgency. In California, Lockheed's Burbank plant found the same rectangular miracle-solving problems they had not anticipated. P-38 Lightnings, with their twin-boom design and turbo superchargers, demanded precise calibration. The new hangars, such work had been hostage to weather. Now, calibration bays functioned day and night, rain or shine, their steel walls echoing with the hum of power tools and the hiss of testing equipment. The hangars protected the delicate instruments that made the Lightning the high-altitude killer it became. Across the country, similar scenes unfolded. In Tulsa, Douglas aircraft workers rolled out newly minted C-47 transports straight into rows of box steel hangars turned into mobile workshops. At North American's Kansas City plant, P-51 Mustangs received their final test flights under the shelter of these metal boxes before being ferried east. At each of these places, the hangars served a second-purpose standardization. Every modification line, every inspection station, every tool rack was laid out nearly identically from one airfield to the next. A mechanic trained in Long Beach could walk into a hangar in Oklahoma or Michigan and know exactly where everything was. Wrenches, torque meters, ignition analyzers, spare parts all arranged on identical shelves bolted to identical walls. Training that once required months could be transferred across the nation almost instantly. A War Department study from mid-1943 put it plainly: uniform buildings permit uniform procedures. This was not poetry, it was arithmetic. The hangar's shape, its dimensions, its modular design all combined to produce efficiency gains that rippled across the aviation war effort. Time saved in maintenance was time added to flight hours. Time saved in training was time added to combat readiness. The factory airfields also enabled something Germany could never match: surge capacity. When the United States needed more long-range bombers for the Pacific, assembly lines ramped up, and the surrounding hangars absorbed the increase without strain. When new radar systems or bomb racks required rapid installation across the fleet, the Temeke, standardized hangars made it possible to implement modifications in parallel across dozens of bases. The same upgrade blueprint could be applied from Maine to Arizona. Germany's fixed concrete hangars, magnificent in isolation, became bottlenecks under pressure. The Luftwaffe could not create new air stations quickly. They could not mass-modify aircraft at scale. They could not train mechanics in structures built overnight from steel ribs and bolts. America could, and America did. Even more transformative was what the hangar made possible in aviation ferry operations. Air Transport Command used fields from Montana to Florida as stepping stones in the movement of aircraft to Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. The box hangars turned these fields into living hubs, places where aircraft could be refueled, repaired, upgraded, and flown onward within hours. The vast circulation of planes across the United States depended on these plain, nearly invisible structures more than on any runway or control tower. And then there was Alaska. The Lend-Lease route to Siberia needed hangars that could withstand ice storms, Arctic winds, and temperatures that shattered metal. Weatherproofing traditional structures would have required years. But the box-shaped hangars, insulated, reinforced, rapidly erected, turned Fairbanks, Ladd Field, and Galena into dependable staging areas for the dangerous transpolar ferry flights. Soviet pilots who arrived to collect aircraft often marveled that their American hosts could build heated facilities in places where they themselves struggled for shelter. One Soviet officer, according to a post-war interpreter's diary, remarked, "In our country, we build walls first. In America, you build roof first. It is faster." He was not wrong. By mid-1943, the United States had built more than 1,000 standardized steel hangars, and the program was only accelerating. Newspapers wrote about the deluge of planes rolling off assembly lines, but they seldom mentioned the dull metal boxes standing beside them. Yet those structures were the silent machinery behind the miracle. Without roofs, the sky could not be filled. Without shelters, air power remained theory. Behind every bomber formation headed for Europe, behind every fighter squadron deploying to the Pacific, behind every transport carrying supplies over the Himalayas, stood a rectangular hangar where young mechanics had kept aluminum machines alive through cold nights and hot afternoons. They were not symbols, they were systems, and America, armed with them, was only beginning to understand what it could accomplish. By late 1943, the box-shaped hangar had become more than shelter, more than workshop, more than modular architecture. It had become the beating heart of the largest aviation training system the world had ever known. Across countless states, from Arizona's deserts to Maine's pine forests, new pilots stepped into cockpits not because America had airplanes, but because America had places to prepare them. The numbers alone defied belief. The Army Air Forces were training more than 100,000 pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and mechanics a year. A flood of humans, each one requiring machines, instructors, tools, and above all buildings where the night's tasks could continue long after the sun dipped below the horizon. The hangar met that need with silent, unromantic reliability. At Langley Field, where Arizona heat once halted training by mid-morning, the steel shelters moderated the worst extremes. Inside the box-shaped hangars, Nighttime maintenance shifted into high gear. Under rows of identical lamps, tools clattered, propellers turned by hand, magneto-checks were performed, and mechanics shouted over the hum of generators. AT-6 Texans and P-40 Warhawks rolled in with dust-choked radiators, scorched brakes, and engines that needed love. They rolled out ready for dawn sorties. In Florida, at Sarasota and Clewiston and Eglin, humidity once corroded radios and fouled spark plugs, but the metal hangars vented, elevated, and reinforced kept moisture off the machine guts. The hangar roofs thudded with afternoon rain while work continued uninterrupted below. At Randolph Field in Texas, known as the West Point of the Air, instructors devised a new ritual: hangar classrooms. Chalkboards hung between structural ribs, wings half disassembled, served as teaching aids. Trainees studied piston timing, hydraulic systems, and fuel flow diagrams, not in barracks but beside the aircraft themselves. And because each hangar across America shared nearly identical dimensions, an airman trained in Texas could walk into a hangar in California or the Carolinas and know instantly where everything belonged, like walking into a familiar house. Standardization had become pedagogy. Mechanics, often overlooked in heroic narratives, were becoming one of the decisive factors of the war. A fighter squadron with poor maintenance was a grounded squadron. A bomber group with sloppy inspections was a funeral procession. And so America trained mechanics with the same intensity it trained pilots. This required space. And the box-shaped hangar, plain as punched steel, provided it. One report from the Air Service Command in late 1943 noted that the average hangar supported the training and upkeep of 40 aircraft weekly. Multiply that by the thousands of hangars rising across the nation, and the magnitude became clear. America had not built an air force. It had built a machine that created air forces. Pilots felt the difference. Cadet William Harper, training at Minter Field in California, wrote to his mother, "The hangar is where we live. The barracks are for sleep. The hangar is for everything else." He was not exaggerating. Pilots studied flight patterns there. They practiced radio calls. They sat cross-legged on concrete floors reviewing aerial gunnery films projected against steel walls. They rehearsed engine-out procedures and emergency landings, while instructors walked them around actual aircraft framed within the rectangular walls. Training wings often turned one corner of a hangar into a fear clinic. Mechanics would simulate failures, fuel leaks, overheating, magneto faults on grounded aircraft, forcing students to diagnose problems under pressure. This was possible only because the hangars were consistent across fields. A malfunction staged in Alabama could be replicated perfectly in California. Bad habits were erased, good habits were reproduced. And then came winter. The winter of 1943 was particularly brutal in the northern states. At Great Falls Army Air Base, snow piled waist-deep around the hangars. In Minnesota, winds cut across frozen runways like knives. Before the steel hangars, weather like this crippled training for weeks. Engines refused to start, tools froze to fingers. Aircraft left outdoors accumulated ice until they resembled sculptures rather than machines. But inside the hangars, the work continued. Space heaters roared, frost crackled harmlessly on the outer walls. B-19 and B-25 training groups prepared aircraft for missions, warmed up engines, and completed inspections as if it were spring. For the first time in aviation history, a nation had made its climate irrelevant. Germany could not imagine such a thing. Its fixed concrete facilities were strong, but few, and often grounded by weather. America's training system, by contrast, ran 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. In part because thousands of identical metal rectangles turned any season, any place, into a workable environment. The hangars also enabled surge training. When bomber losses over Europe spiked in late 1943 and early 1944, General Arnold increased pilot and crew training quotas. The air forces expanded, almost instantly. New training squadrons formed. New instructors were assigned. And because the hangars already existed identical, modular, uniform, the infrastructure absorbed the increase without collapse. The German records captured after the war show that Luftwaffe analysts were baffled by how rapidly America expanded. One report read, "Their capacity grows like a living organism." Another added, "They train pilots faster than we can count ours." The truth was simpler. America trained in rectangles. Rectangles that blocked wind and rain. Rectangles that held warmth in winter and shade in summer. Rectangles that housed tools, engines, chalkboards, spare parts, training films, hope, and exhaustion. Rectangles that never slept. By 1943, the box-shaped hangar was no longer just part of America's aviation system. It was the system. A system built not on genius or beauty, but on multiplication. A system that allowed the United States to produce more pilots, more mechanics, and more flight-ready aircraft than any nation in history had ever imagined possible. A system born from a plain, steel rectangle that should not have mattered and yet changed everything. By early 1944, the box-shaped hangar had spread so completely across the American landscape that it was no longer a wartime innovation, it was an environmental fact. They dotted deserts, prairies, coastal plains, frozen plateaus, and muddy Mississippi bottoms. If you were to fly across the United States that year, in a B-17 or a P-38, you could look down and count them like stepping stones, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But the true proof of their significance did not emerge in America. It emerged overseas. The hangars that followed the war did so not by ship, but by blueprint. The ones that were shipped flat-packed, crated, and sealed became the skeletons of new air forces being born under fire. In Britain, in North Africa, in the Plate, jungles of the South Pacific, in the Aleutians, and in the coral atolls across the Central Pacific, the American expeditionary airfields came to life inside steel rectangles that arrived by the score. They came off transports in crates stenciled with cryptic codes. One hangar, portable, Type A, steel frame, weight, 4 tons, assembly, 8 men, 1 day. It sounded impossible. It was not. In late 1942, after Operation Torch, American airfields blossomed across Algeria and Morocco with astonishing speed. Civil engineers, many of whom had never set foot outside the continental United States, found themselves supervising airbase construction in places where roads were little more than suggestions. Bulldozers cleared the earth. Graders scraped runways out of hard, sun-baked ground. Tents went up. Fuel depots grew like mushrooms. And beside all of it, steel rib after steel rib arched toward the sky. A logistics officer at La Seigneur Airfield wrote, "Every hangar means aircraft can fly 2 more hours tomorrow." He wasn't exaggerating. Shade alone increased engine reliability. Protection from desert wind kept sand from devouring propeller bearings. The hangars let P-40 Warhawks and A-20 Havocs stay alive in a climate where Germany had lost aircraft simply to grit and heat. The Luftwaffe noticed the change almost immediately. Their North African diary entries captured after the war mention enemy shelters appearing at bewildering speed. One German officer wrote bitterly, "They build houses faster than we dig trenches." If North Africa tested the hangar with sand, the Aleutian Islands tested it with ice. In 1943, American forces preparing to retake Attu and Kiska needed staging grounds in a place where winds tore wood apart like kindling. Traditional construction methods were impossible. Lumber warped. Concrete cracked. The weather was a weapon. But the hangar didn't care. At Adak and Amchitka, Seabees erected steel hangars in storms that would have halted any other construction. They bolted frozen panels with numb fingers, secured beams with ropes to keep them from becoming sails, and watched heaters thaw the interiors into workable, almost comfortable spaces. P-39s, P-40s, and B-25s emerged from the metal rectangles each dawn, their engines warm, their instruments dry, their pilots alive. The hangars became lifelines. A pilot from the 11th Air Force wrote home, "Without the hangars, the wind would have killed the war." In Britain, The hangars did more than shelter planes. They became modular tools of the strategic air war. As American heavy bombers piled into East Anglia B-17s at Thorpe Abbotts, B-24s at Hardwick, B-25s at Boxted, maintenance demands exploded. Engines needed overhauls. Oxygen lines needed replacement. Turbo superchargers needed tuning. Battle damage repairs required speed and standardization. The steel, rectangles identical from airfield to airfield, made that possible. A crew chief from the 8th Air Force called them the quiet miracle. He explained, "A plane landed, shot to hell. In 1 hour, it was inside a hangar. In 2 hours, men were on it. In 12 hours, it was ready for another run." Those numbers, multiplied across thousands of aircraft, meant Germany faced a relentless bombing campaign that no air defense system could outlast. But nowhere did the hangars shape the war as dramatically as in the Pacific. In New Guinea, engineers carved airfields from swamps and palm groves. The hangars arrived in crates labelled Priority Air Operations. They went up on ground so wet that workers often sank to their ankles. Inside the hangars, though, engines stayed dry, tools stayed clean, and aircraft stayed alive in conditions that would have crippled any pre-war air force. P-38 Lightnings, P-47s, and A-26 Invaders launched from these improvised bases to strike Japanese positions hundreds of miles away. B-25 Mitchells rolled out of hangars that still smelled of jungle rot and fresh steel. One Japanese diary entry recovered by Allied translator and interpreter service simply read, "They appear from islands where no airfields existed last month." America was building airfields faster than Japan could find them on maps. By early 1944, the steel hangar had become the signature of American expansion. It was the same in England, the same in the Aleutians, the same in Australia, the same in Africa, the same in the continental United States. A historian writing in 1962 summarized it best. No other structure in the war was so unremarkable, yet so indispensable. The hangar did not win battles, it did not shoot down enemy planes, but it made everything else possible. It was the building that followed the war across oceans, across climates, across continents, and, wherever it went, an air force was born. And the world was only beginning to understand its full impact. By mid-1944, the greatest fear inside the Army Air Forces was not German jets, or flak, or fuel shortages, or even pilot attrition. It was throughput. Could America move enough aircraft fast enough, reliably enough, in great enough volume to sustain global air operations simultaneously in Europe, the Mediterranean, China, Burma, India, the Aleutians, and the Central Pacific? Every intelligence estimate said the same thing. A modern air war was not won by the planes in the sky, but by the planes on the ground waiting to replace them. The fear was simple. If the system jammed, if the flow broke, if the pipeline clogged at any point from factory to depot to front line, then the entire air strategy collapsed. This was not speculation. The Luftwaffe had suffered exactly that fate in 1941 and 1942. Germany had factories, yes, skilled, engineers, certainly, but it lacked the infrastructure to move airframes from production to combat. Engines piled up in warehouses. Partially completed aircraft languished for want of space. New fighters sat outdoors awaiting modification and rusted in the rain. America watched that catastrophe closely, and prevented it with a shape that looked nothing like a weapon, a rectangular hangar with a corrugated skin and a steel spine. In July of 1944, as Operation Overlord roared across France and B-29s hammered Japan from China, General Arnold demanded a report on system capacity. How many aircraft could the logistical pipeline absorb at maximum load? The Quartermaster, the Air Service Command, and the Transportation Corps all came back with the same astonishing conclusion. There is no bottleneck. We can handle more. It was the opposite of what every historian expected. The report laid out why. America had built not just factories, not just assembly, lines, not just depots, but a continental grid of processing points, each one anchored by rows of standardized hangars. The system looked like this. Assembly plants pushed new airframes to first-stop fields. These fields executed the first inspections inside identical hangars. Aircraft were flown to modification centers, also centered around identical hangars. After modifications, they moved to replacement centers, staging fields, or training bases again, all using the same hangars. Only then did they reach operational depots overseas. At every point on that journey were the same steel rectangles, the same internal layouts, the same tool racks, the same lighting, the same lift points, the same anchor bolts for engine stands. Standardization had erased the bottleneck. A plane that left Lockheed Burbank could move through Kansas, Texas, Georgia, and Maine and find the same building waiting for it each time, never delayed for lack of space, shelter, or facilities. The modification centers were the quiet giants behind the miracle of throughput. Every new aircraft, no matter how advanced, required region-specific changes. Radar for Europe, tropical filters for Burma, long-range tanks for the Pacific, de-icing for the Aleutians, extra armor for bomber groups under heavy fire. Before the war, such modifications were done slowly in specialized facilities. During the war, they happened inside hundreds of identical hangars spread across the country. At Birmingham Army Airfield, crews installed improved oxygen systems in entire squadrons of fighters. At Dallas Naval Air Station, P-70 Encounters received new gunnery cameras. At Albuquerque, B-29 crews learned emergency procedures as mechanics rewired bomb release circuitry in the hangars beside them. These centers processed tens of thousands of aircraft without delay because the hangar's rectangular footprint made everything predictable. Tool carts moved efficiently, cranes mounted to standardized beams lifted engines in minutes. Spare parts fit into preset racks bolted to steel walls. The structure had become a machine. When the European air war intensified after D-Day, America replaced aircraft at a rate that stunned German intelligence. A bomber group could lose 10 aircraft on one mission and receive 10 replacements within 48 hours. How? Because the planes already existed. The hangars already existed. The pipeline already existed. A B-17 damaged in France might crash land in England. A replacement B-17 rolled out of a modification center in the United States and entered a hangar for final checks. Within hours, it was airborne across the Atlantic. Within a day, it was folded into a combat group. No drama, no fanfare, no pause in operations. Germany, by contrast, often took weeks to replace a single fighter in a frontline unit because concrete hangars were few, difficult to repair, and often bombed. In the Central Pacific, throughput became the deciding factor in island-hopping strategy. Each captured atoll required a strip of crushed coral fuel tanks, radio shacks, communications trenches, and, crucially, steel hangars. Because without the hangars, P-47s and P-38s simply could not survive salt spray, violent squalls, or subtropical corrosion. The Navy's Seabees could erect the hangars in 12 to 20 hours once the crates were opened. Aircraft arrived sometimes before the hangars were fully assembled. Mechanics finished tightening bolts while engines warmed on the flight line. This speed enabled the leapfrogging campaign from Tarawa to Makin to Kwajalein to Saipan. The Japanese defenders were stunned that American aircraft appeared so quickly after landings. Diaries recovered after the war mention the same phrase again and again. Americans build airfields faster than we destroy them. By 1944, the Army Air Forces calculated that its continental infrastructure could process more aircraft than the factories could produce, an inversion unheard of in wartime. The bottleneck never came. Not once, not anywhere in the chain. Because America had built the roofs, the walls, the workspaces, the modular interiors, the standardized environment long before the sky filled with airplanes. The hangar had become a throughput multiplier so powerful that even historians struggle to quantify it. But the pilots knew, the mechanics knew, the depot crews knew, and the enemy knew. America's airpower did not rest on wings alone. It rested on rectangles. Simple, silent, corrugated rectangles that kept the river of machines flowing. Unstoppable, from factory to front line. And that flow, relentless, disciplined, unbroken, would soon overwhelm the Axis entirely. By early 1945, even before victory was in sight, Army Air Force's analysts began compiling internal assessments of what had made the American aviation ecosystem function so smoothly. The preliminary drafts all reached the same startling conclusion. The limiting factor of global airpower was not pilots, engines, aluminum, fuel, or runways. It was shelter. Shelter not in the romantic sense of vast hangars bristling with engineering marvels, but in the quiet, rectangular monotony of standardized boxes scattered across a continent and flung across every captured island in the Pacific. The analysts wrote the finding as plainly as possible. A plane cannot fly if it cannot be serviced. It cannot be serviced if it cannot be sheltered. Every nation in the war had built aircraft. Only one nation built the environment in which aircraft could thrive. At the heart of this environmental transformation was a revolution in maintenance philosophy. Before the war, most air forces treated maintenance as a slow, artisanal craft performed in centralized depots. Mechanics relied on experience, improvisation, and specialized knowledge. Repairs took time. The box-shaped hangar changed that. Inside its standardized footprint, maintenance became predictable, trainable, repeatable, and astonishingly fast. A freshly trained 18-year-old mechanic in Oklahoma could step into a hangar in Guam and find the same layout he had trained in stateside, same anchor points, same skylights, same electrical conduit arrangements, same shelving, same hoist rails. What had once been a craft became a process. Turnaround time for fighters shrank to hours. B-24 Liberators could be serviced simultaneously, one under each lighting array, their wingtips barely clearing the steel ribs that had the same measurements on every airfield from New Jersey to Nandi. Army Air Force's command would later write that maintenance times dropped by nearly half compared to pre-war standards. The only thing that had changed was the building. One of the hidden advantages of standardized hangars was bounce repair, the ability to restore damaged aircraft to combat status within 24 hours. In Italy, during the push through the Apennines, the 12th Air Force calculated that more than half of all battle-damaged P-47s returned to missions within a day because they could be dragged into identical hangars and repaired with identical tools. Crews didn't waste minutes searching for equipment. Everything lived in the same place, in every hangar in the theater. In the Pacific, B-25s returning from low-level strikes over Balikpapan were often leaking fuel, scorched with oil, or riddled with bullet holes. The rectangular hangars at Biak and Oe Island became triage centers with predictable workflows, patch teams, fuel crews, armament crews, engine crews, all rotating automatically based on the universal interior layout. Without these hangars, aircraft would have been scattered outdoors, exposed to tropical weather that could turn minor damage into structural failure within hours. With them, America achieved something astonishing. The Pacific War, fought across thousands of miles, saw higher aircraft availability rates than Germany did, defending its own borders. Shelter, not tactics, was the difference. The hangars also became classrooms. At fields like Tuskegee, Luke, March, and Kirtland, trainee pilots taxied into identical hangars for their first ground checks. They learned to read gauges under the same lighting, inspect control surfaces in the same space, and perform walkarounds along the same floor markings used everywhere else. When these pilots deployed, there was no adjustment period. They stepped into the same buildings, scaled up, yes, but familiar, and found the same rhythms of pre-flight and post-flight procedures. This continuity reduced human error dramatically. German pilots, by contrast, trained in widely varying structures, some in sprawling concrete hangars, others in century-old brick airship halls, and many outdoors under makeshift tarpaulins. Their transition to front line fields was always a shock. The United States eliminated that shock entirely, because every American airfield was designed from a template, and the template was a steel rectangle. One of the most significant yet least studied consequences of the standardized hangar system was dispersal. Germany's concrete hangars were fixed, expensive, and few. Allied bombing repeatedly targeted them, and each destroyed hangar eliminated crucial capacity. America's hangars, by contrast, could be built in clusters, in chains, in arcs, or scattered across fields. A German reconnaissance photo from late 1944 of an American bomber base in Italy shows something extraordinary. More than 50 identical hangars spread across terrain where one or two pre-war concrete structures might have existed. This dispersal meant a single bomb run could never cripple a base. Fire damage was isolated by design. Every airfield had redundancy in depth. At 19th Air Force Field in France, German night raiders destroyed 12 hangars during a surprise attack. Operations resumed at dawn because there were 30 more. The Luftwaffe never understood what it was, facing a system immune to decapitation. By the end of 1945, internal Army Air Forces reports showed more than 30,000 standardized hangars built in the continental United States, nearly 7,000 shipped overseas, over 4,000 erected on battlefronts or newly captured islands. But the most important number wasn't structural. It was operational. Aircraft readiness rates averaged nearly 75% in every active theatre, even during peak combat intensity. This was unprecedented. No other air force in the world matched it, and it had nothing to do with aircraft design. It was the consequence of shelter that was cheap, repeatable, modular, and omnipresent. The kind of shelter that pilots ignored, mechanics appreciated, quartermasters worshipped, and historians largely forgot. The simple, steel-sided rectangle had become the spine of a global air war, a shape so dull it disappeared in plain sight, and yet so essential that without it, the skies would have belonged to someone else.